When last we spoke, we had left off at that antebellum era, that before the war, and now we're moving into the much discussed, much researched, documentary after documentary has been made about the American Civil War. Now, we've said all along that this exhibit is really based on community questions. And one of the questions that we hear time and time again when visitors come to the museum is there a battlefield nearby? Can we go see a Civil War battlefield? And really this section of the exhibit about the American Civil War is not about that. It's about the stories of everyone who was here in the 1860s. We all have had multiple conversations about the causes of the war, the impacts of the war. And we do that here at the museum, but we look at particular figures, what stories they've left behind. So as we take a look through the exhibit, we call your attention to the things that people have saved, the things that people deemed sort of worthy of telling their family story, but also the research that's now ongoing as we learn more and more about those players. Certainly, we can look at these artifacts, we can look at armaments, we look at things that sometimes have a little bit of a nebulous history or not quite certain where they came from. They just happen to be in Grandma's attic. You know, where did this come from? Then we have things that are far more illustrious and able to tell their story. For example, we have this chest that was maintained and kept for more than 150 years now, as we have this chest that belonged to Marquis de Lafayette Red, who we see so frequently in county documents. So his story is well accounted for. We look at letters, and letters are few and far between, but we just happen to have a few that were donated more than 15 years ago here to the museum's collection. And we use these letters not just to talk about a Civil War experience, but the experience of families who are separated by war, by military service, by miles and miles, and how the way in which we communicate has changed in the last 150 years. So it's not just about telling the story of 1861 to 1864, it's about talking about family experience and how that's changed. We also talk about those peoples who were enslaved and who were free people of color who escaped, who left this place to fight for emancipation, to fight for the cause of freedom, going to New Bern, going to Beaufort, North Carolina, to enlist in the United States Army and the United States Navy. So this story is not necessarily about battles of the Civil War. It's about individual experience. That is not to say we don't talk about battles. One in particular, which is really of national renown, is the story of the Battle of New River, and the ever-dashing, as we like to call him, and intrepid, and I've recently heard him called audacious, Lieutenant Commander William Barker Cushing, who was a United States naval officer who led a raid up the New River to Jacksonville. Cushing is kind of he's seen as the naval hero of the American Civil War, and we talk about his escapades here in Onslow County. We also have a variety of artifacts that we share you from an archaeological excavation that took place in the New River that helps us understand Cushing's story more, and his role here, the fact that this figure came here. So we're going to give you really a broad understanding of the Civil War, but more specifically, individual experiences. Now, at the end of the Civil War, we move into the era known as Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, there again, we're changing our understanding of that era. What did it mean in the years following a war that nearly tore our nation asunder? You know, when our nation is ripped apart and we have to knit it back together, that process is not like knitting a sweater back together. It's more like knitting bone back together. And it is painful, and it is difficult, and it will take years, and there will be forward movement and certainly backward movement. And we talk about what happens here in Onslow County during that Reconstruction era, what will happen, and then how in 1867 we just don't turn a switch and we're a nation back together. There will be many, many more years of hardship, of difficulty, of progress, and of change. And so we want you to come here to the Onslow County Museum, learn more about what that era of the 1860s meant, and then we'll find out what happens as we move into the late 19th century and then the dawn of the 20th century here in Onslow County. As always, we are so grateful for having you here as we tour on Tuesdays, The Water and the Wood. We'll see you next time.